Hello and welcome back. You're watching Numbers and the Narrative. And in this edition of our special series, we are going to be talking about the big number, the country's GDP. The government is set to release new data on GDP in a few hours from now. The new data essentially shifts the base year of calculating our GDP from 2011-12 to 2022-23. That's not all. There are a whole lot of changes that are being introduced in order to address all the shortcomings and criticism that have been around about the way we calculate our GDP now. It is expected that the new methods will significantly make the data more reliable, more dependable, and present a more realistic picture of the economy. I have with me my friend, an alum of Delhi School of Economics, who has been on this show before, Dhananjay Sinha of the Systematix Group, to tell us about the new method, what it means, what could be its implications. Before that, a bit of background that one would like to share. What really has been the issue? We have been for the past few years hearing that our economy has been growing at a very fast rate, almost nearing 8% in recent quarters. If the economy is growing at such a high rate, where is the party? Why does the middle class feel squeezed? Why have wages stagnated or in some cases are even declining in real terms? Why have the stock markets remained flat for nearly 1.5 years? Why is foreign capital moving out of the country? Now, this is a paradox. And it is such a paradox that it has prompted organizations like International Monetary Fund to flag the shortcomings in the way we calculate our data. So much so that in November 2025, the IMF actually said the quality of our data is actually C grade. And we have people like Arvind Subramanian, who was the chief economic advisor to the government of India, and several other economists saying that the real GDP growth could be actually much lower than what the government has been claiming for the past several years. Arvind Subramanian says it could be overstated by almost 2 percentage points. In other words, the economy might be growing really at a rate of 5 to 6%. So, how does that happen? What really is the problem? The problem lies here. Since the time, the currently the GDP data that we use is based on 2011-12 series. In other words, the methodology was devised keeping in mind the way the economy was composed then. But a lot has changed since. We have had demonetization, which has significantly altered the economic landscape. The informal sector has shrunk. The formal sector has gained dominance. There has been the GST rollout, which has again brought about significant changes. And in the course of this, digital technology has also altered the economic landscape in a big way. Services sector, new services have come up, and we haven't created methodologies to capture those changes. So, therefore, the new series with the base year 2022-23 is expected to address some of these shortcomings. Now, the biggest shortcoming was in the current methodology, we don't have a way to measure how the informal sector is growing when we come up with our quarterly GDP data. The way the formal sector or the organized sector is going, we take that growth rate as a proxy to the informal sector. Now, what we know that after demonetization and subsequent developments of GST rollout and COVID-19, the informal sector has been shrinking. So, in other words, the growth proxy that you have been using for the informal sector could be misleading. So, that was the first problem that had to be fixed. I will go over to Dhananjay to explain how these things are sought to be fixed now. I'm just setting the background and setting the context. The other big problem was the way the GDP growth is calculated. First, we arrive by aggregating all the numbers at what is called a nominal GDP number. Then we adjust it to inflation, which is called, we use a deflator to reach what is the real GDP growth. If nominal GDP growth is 10%, and if we use a deflator or if we adjust it to inflation and the deflator value is 1%, then we say real GDP has grown at 9%. Now, for this deflator, we have been leaning on the wholesale price index, which really doesn't tell you how at a consumer level or at a consumption level prices are changing. And often the wholesale price index tends to underestimate price changes, which means you get the deflator, you get a smaller number. As a result of which, you end up overstating the real GDP growth. That's the second big problem that the new methodology is seeking to fix. Now, let me go over to Dhananjay and let him explain how these two principal problems are sought to be fixed, and besides this, how the government is proposing to bring in more robustness into calculating our GDP. Here is the graphic, pointer graphic. Dhananjay, take it forward.
So, yeah, thank you very much, Rajesh, for having me and explaining the backdrop. So, basically, the big problem that the country faces, and I think there is a considerable amount of disconnect between the way economic agents, which is including households, corporates, government itself, and policymakers as a whole, are seeing the actual problem with respect to the macroeconomic conditions and how the data is reflecting the growth to be or the economy to be. So essentially, there is a considerable amount of disparity. On the one hand, we are saying that we are the fastest growing economy and we are the fourth largest and are likely to be the third largest economy in the world. Whereas what we see across the board, that the households are grappling with stagnancy in the income, both in terms of the growth of the nominal growth of incomes have actually been fairly modest. Even for the formal sector workers, also we are seeing the guys who are actually paying taxes. There, the growth over the last 10 years has been roughly about 5 or 6%, barely matching the inflation level on an aggregate basis. Whereas we are also seeing that structurally more and more people are dependent on agriculture sector, and that's essentially happening because the formal sector, there has been a sort of a reduction in the employment elasticity. So all that is actually translating into lower productivity. And we are also aware that while the government has actually implemented a lot of spending on capex, etc., on infrastructure related, it has not translated into a sort of a sustainable private capex or a virtuous cycle. So I think there is a clear dichotomy between what is the headline GDP growth and what the underlying scenario is. And more recently, we have seen that the rupee has actually depreciated to an all-time low. It had also crossed 92 levels, and we have seen that foreign capital flows, both with respect to FDI and FPI, has been very modest, and Indian capital markets have been underperforming compared to the global peers. So I think these are the things that are there. I think the root problem is that because the economy has undergone a structural change with respect to both with respect to the overall structure of the economy as technology has changed, there's more capital deepening that has happened, and also because there are multiple shocks that have happened, including starting from the demonetization, the GST implementation, NBFC crisis, then there is tariff shocks also, and then the pandemic shock. So essentially, the structure of the economy has changed considerably for multiple reasons, both domestic and global, which is not really reflected in the base level of the national income statistics that was arrived at in the 2011-12 series. So I think what has happened as a result, there is a, as Rajesh has also pointed out, is that uh, the representation of the sectors that have actually faced the brunt of this transformation is actually overstated, because a lot of our data is actually based on the formal sector data, which has a sort of a sort of a survival bias. So there is a shift of the economic market share from the informal sector to the formal sector. The formalization has also translated into a sort of a bias which overstates the overall GDP growth as the extrapolation happens. Apart from that, there are criticism with respect to the methodology. The 2011-12 series essentially relies heavily on the MCA 21 data, and also there is a flaw in terms of the NIC codes that have been used. There is a lot of, even in the base year, the representation of various manufacturing sector or industry level representation or self-reporting that has been done by various entities. There has been a considerable misrepresentation, wherein we have seen that some services sector units have reported themselves as manufacturing. A lot of flaw and gap is also there in the NIC code. So there is a considerable amount of flaw over there as well. Apart from that, the whatever data that the earlier methodology captured, essentially underrepresented the unorganized sector. So that distortion has actually expanded quite significantly over the last decade or so. As a result, we think that my analysis shows that there is a considerable amount of overstatement as far as the nominal GDP growth, nominal GDP is concerned. And if I look at just the money supply data and relate it to the...
Dhananjay, we will take these things first after we tell our audience what is the change that is now being done. So if you could explain, the chart that I have now, now how we are going to bring in annual GST data, how they're going to be leaning more on direct surveys. Just explain this a bit.
So basically, this methodology that I talked about, the gaps that are there are sought to be filled with more granular data. So if you look at the industry-wise data, we have data available on GST, and on GST we have fairly granular data where the GST has been collected, and based on that we can have a more regional diversification can be represented in the overall economic activity, especially the manufacturing sector data. Likewise, there was certain amount of extrapolation that was happening for NBFCs. So basically, you're using the MCA data, which basically capturing the diversification of the NBFC and the proliferation that has happened. So that is there. There are granular data for the banking sector available from the RBI, which is also considering the regional diversity. So basically that data is also being plugged into the whole thing. I think most important thing is that the government has come up with, and this reflects the disparity also, that multiple surveys that the government has done with respect to the periodic labor force survey and also the unorganized, unregistered enterprises data that are there. These represent roughly about 90, especially the PLFS data represent over 90% of the labor force. So that basically tells us the average growth in wages has actually been fairly modest, and over the last I would say 6 years or so, the real wages have actually been flat to negative across unorganized sector, casual labor, and self-employed. So we have done this aggregation. So it restarted in 2018, and
that's
that
that's going to be captured now. That's going to be
that
captured
is
now.
going to be captured now, and also the... Yeah. So the other survey that is there is the ASU survey, which basically represents the data of the unregistered and unregistered enterprises. These are small entities that are there, and this was started after a gap of 7 years, which shows that again the small enterprises, that there has been a decline in the value addition per unit, and there is a sort of a capital deepening, and real wages are actually declined or flattened. So if you plug that ASUS data, as we did the exercise earlier, it shows that for the sectors that were represented by the survey, which is manufacturing, some part of services excluding government services, and some so these are some sectors that three sectors that were actually represented there. And if you plug that into the GDP data for the 45% of the component which are supposed to be unorganized, the GDP number comes down in real terms by roughly about 200 basis point. Likewise, we know that while the GDP numbers are showing a very, very robust growth, it was not matching with the real wages for large part of the population. So that is again been represented here. The third thing is very important, is the household consumption expenditure survey, which if you look at, there is again a very considerable, there is a large gap between the last survey and the latest one, roughly about 12 years gap, and we calculated the real consumption growth out there, and it shows that the real consumption growth at the survey level was roughly about 3%, whereas the national income data shows consumption growth growing at something like 6%. So clearly, if you plug in all these survey data, which are very granular, and now the government is doing it on a much regular basis, you have the capability to upgrade the quality of reporting of the data, and the misrepresentation of the overall economic picture that is shown through the survey data, through the GDP data, which is significantly based on extrapolation and using of proxies, will be far more granular. So there's going to be a whole host of data which is going to be very granular, ranging from the NPFC data, from the banking sector, GST data, and the various surveys that are there. So I think there is a likelihood of a considerable upgradation as far as the qualitative aspect of the GDP numbers are concerned. So I think that is a
Just
good
to
thing.
the chart we have, you illustrated how on the basis of old
Yes.
series we are getting a 6% real consumption growth, but when you go by the actual survey,
Yes.
it's now turning out to be 3%, almost half that space.
Yes.
Similarly, the other data that you talked about using the ASU data, which is the unregistered enterprises,
Data. Yeah.
it actually this graph shows very clearly that there has been a steady decline in both the real gross value added and the real wages through
Correct.
these years over the last
Yes.
between 2016 to 2023. I
Yes.
mean, there was this is being released after a gap of 7 years, and this is quite alarming. Yeah,
Right.
great. Thank you. Yeah, carry on.
So basically, I think as far as the labor, see, the thing is that the new series, I would assume, if all the survey data is being represented, and I suppose all that has been said in the change in methodology, the report that has been published, if all that is incorporated, clearly we are seeing a downside bias to the nominal GDP. If you represent let's say the 92% of the labor force, where we are seeing that real wages have been stagnant or declining, clearly you can't really tell us that the GDP is growing at 8%, 7%, right? When the actual growth is consumption growth is 3%. We also know that from other sources that the savings have actually, financial savings have been declining. So if you have the consumption growth being lower and the household savings have actually moderated, clearly the household income, which is almost like 80% of the GDP, is not really growing. And if that is not growing, of course, the GDP might not be growing as robustly as is been represented by the
So,
GDP numbers. Yeah.
in your view, you are
Yes.
saying when the new series is released in a few hours
Yes.
from now,
Right.
uh, if it's done rightly as
Yes.
it is claimed, the revised numbers might be 200 basis points uh, give and
Lower.
take here, lower. But
Hmm.
I saw, various banks and investment bankers have come up with some forecasts, including the economic sale of the State Bank of India, saying that GDP growth in FY 25-26 could actually be higher at 8% or more compared to what the government had projected based on the old series, which was 7.4%. So why are they saying that?
So I can't tell what the methodology that they have used. I think one important thing that has to be also added here is that last year's growth, FY25, the first half data is FY26 data. It's basically showing a growth of roughly about 8%. Now, what is important to note is that there is a significant change that will happen with respect to the deflator also. So the
Hmm.
fact that in the first half of this year, the average inflation or deflator that has been used is just 0.5%. And basically it shows that while the nominal GDP growth has fallen, the fall in the inflation deflator is much faster, and that gives a illusion of a much stronger growth in real terms. So deflator is an important thing. A major problem with the earlier series is that we have a uniform deflator which is largely aligned to the WPI series. And WPI series over the last, it is largely, it's very cyclical in nature, very sensitive to global commodity prices. And I would say if you remove the period of post COVID, when there was a spot in global commodity prices, if you remove that, since 2014, the commodity prices has been in deflationary mode, which means that the input cost for various manufacturing units, for instance, especially in the formal sector, which has gained market share from the informal sector, they saw expansion in margin because of the fall in commodity prices. Now, once you actually show that operating profit, the value added, which is value of output minus the cost of input, and that would expand in the falling commodity prices, and then you deflate that with a WPI, which is again dominated by the commodity prices, which means this whole expansion in value addition gets overstated once again,
Twice.
and and,
Twice.
and twice. So basically, what it does, it gives you a sense, it gives you an impression that the output has actually been growing much rapidly, whereas it is basically the expansion in margins and the deflator which is overstating the growth. So see what has happened over the last, let's say we are talking about data after 2013, for instance. The NS Nifty 50 profit growth has averaged roughly about 3.5% during 2019 to 2014 to 2013 2019, roughly about 6 years. The average growth has been hovering about 3 to 4%. Now, if you have a productive sector, which is the corporate sector, growing at 3.5% growth, how would you imagine that the overall economy would be growing much faster? You understand? So what is important is that the new series will actually have a much more uh, you know stratified inflation series, and it would actually deflate the output and the input in a different way, so that this it will actually have a double deflator that would happen. A major criticism to the GDP estimate for India in real terms is the deflator, also because there is a significant bias towards using WPI to deflate everything. And I think important thing is especially the services sector, which is roughly about 60% of the GDP. That if you deflate by WPI is considerably wrong, because the WPI represents commodities and goods, and you can't be deflating using the same deflator for the services sector. So basically, use of WPI as a deflator, which is a predominant, roughly about 80% of the deflator will be reflecting the WPI for services sector, which is a dominant portion of your GDP, is basically would actually overstate the value addition, especially because you're using WPI for the cost, where the cost increase
Right.
might be much larger. And
Right.
I would say, especially on the consumption side, important thing is, again, when you use deflator, whereas the income growth and the consumption growth should be actually be deflated by the CPI. Now, once you actually change the deflator, the weightage that would go to the CPI would be higher, and the CPI has been higher than the WPI when the commodity prices are deflating. So essentially, the deflator will move up. As a result of that, I think ideally, given a certain nominal growth, the real growth should actually come down.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for explaining. It's a lot of there are lots of complications, and it's a complex thing. Not
Yeah.
easy to break it down for
So,
everyone.
so,
But
for a normal person, it has to be understood this way, that the cost of living is rising much larger than much faster than the wage growth, and people are seeing that with respect to how they can consume. They're cutting corners, they're cutting their savings. If you look at the FMCG companies, volume growth has been fairly modest. I would say HUL volume growth will be 2 or 3%. Many of the companies have shown very modest top line growth. So I think it doesn't, the GDP numbers as has been represented till now, doesn't relate to what companies are telling, what they are experiencing, or households are experiencing. That's
right,
the sum and substance of
right. We
dichotomy.
we we hope that it gets fixed
Yes.
when the government releases the new
Yes.
GDP series, and we hope that all the promises that were made in terms of fixing the shortcomings will be done. It's never a perfect job, but we hope that to the extent possible those things are rectified. Having said that, I am hearing now two sets of views. You are saying when the numbers come out in a few hours from now, you expect the GDP growth numbers to be lower than the real GDP growth numbers, to be lower than what has been reported
Till
using
now.
the old series for the past quarters or past years. Because when the government releases this new series, even the past year's data will stand revised. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm hearing uh, organizations like SBI and several other people saying that they actually expect a higher number. Now, obviously, they must be having some logic and reason behind it. Whatever the case may be, whatever the case may be, there is something that one also is looking to see beyond the aggregate number, what it tells. Suppose you get, even if it is understated from 8% to 6%, or if it is 8%, it doesn't matter whether it is 6% or 8%, it is still a very high growth number. How do you explain that high growth number coexisting with the feeling among people of being squeezed, the visible proof that real wages have either stagnated or declined, uh, foreign capital is flying out,
Yes.
rupee is not able to hold its ground.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
I mean, so that kind of, I think, brings us to the last question.
Yes.
Will this data further reinforce or revalidate what many economists, including some people like you and I, have come to believe, that there has been the economic recovery in the aftermath of COVID has been a K-shaped recovery? Would you
Yes.
say that?
Absolutely. So I think it clearly reflects, I think look at the basic things. Even if you look at the government, the policy responses, why do we have to do, let's say, the GST cut? Why do you have to do relaxation of income tax incidents? Why do state governments have to give dole outs across most of the states actually are giving income dole outs to support income. So essentially, in a way, you are actually supporting subsistence. Why do you have to continue giving free food, for instance? Why does why is there a shortfall in tax collection? So this year the revised estimate is almost like 2 lakh crores lesser than what was budgeted. Why are these things happening? Why
1.63 lakh.
1.9 lakh crores? And
That's
why does the government have to prune down various expenditure heads when the economy is growing so robustly? Why are banks struggling for deposits? It basically ties with the fall in savings. So there are so many answer the questions that are that are flashing, and it's so obvious. You can argue whatever, that that most of the guys who are being fed by official sources, they are basically telling that the growth is very robust. They deny that there is a K-shaped recovery. They deny that there is a unemployment problem. If you look at the PLFS data itself, it shows that it is accounting for a substantial amount of disguised unemployment. And my own estimate shows that while the reported unemployment rate has been about 3 to 4%, if you include the disguised employment, especially in the self-employed segment relating to the agriculture sector, the effective unemployment could be as high as 28%. So I would say that these are things that are very important from a policy standpoint. And I would say, the responses, if you look at it, the way RBI has front-loaded liquidity, done rate cuts, and RBI government has actually cut GST rates, and all these things basically reflects that the government is actually confronting a crisis rather than a robust GDP growth. So I think, and we have heard it from corporates, we see it in the performance of various equity indices. If you look at beyond the headline numbers coming from the Nifty 50, if you look at mid and small cap, there is a considerable amount of net worth erosion that has happened, even for the guys who are much more prosperous and who have the money to invest in the equity market. So I think all those things are there. And we also know from foreign capital flows that over the last 10 years, most of the years, almost like 7 to 8 years, 11 years, I would say, if you look at last 11 years, 8 to 9 years, the FII flows has been either negative or very modest. And we know that the net foreign direct investment as percent of GDP has come down to close to zero. And it used to be as high as 3.5% in 2008. So all these indicators are telling us that the economy is actually struggling. Not the robust numbers that the government has been putting out. There are flaws, of course, as we have discussed with respect to methodology and all. With a new series is trying to address that, we will need to see how well that correction is done. You see, the thing is that it will only be a correction and realignment of the GDP numbers to the realistic numbers. Apart from that, what economic agents are facing, which includes household, corporates, government policies included, and foreign investments, all those are already pricing in the reality. The market itself is pricing in the reality. Our markets have actually underperformed most of the global markets over the last 18 months. I think so. The dichotomy is very much there. The GDP numbers will need to be realigned. I mean, that's what it is. The errors
the
have
G-
to be
the G-
removed. That's it.
the GDP numbers will have to be realigned. Perhaps the new series might bring it a little closer to the lived reality. But
Yes.
the bigger paradox that you talked about, uh, that's not going to go away
Yes.
because of a statistical
Yeah.
improvement.
Yes. Yes.
That calls for a very different kind of intervention, very different reckoning of the problem that we have on hand, for which we will come back again and talk separately. Dhananjay, thank you very much. And to our audience, stay with us a few hours from now. Once the government releases the new set of numbers, we will be back with an analysis, and I will have a special economist, probably one of the most respected economists in the country, with me to decipher the new numbers. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Dhananjay, for your time.